The room went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet where everyone's just enjoying their drinks and the hum of conversation. The kind where 70 people suddenly realise they don't quite know what they just heard. I was still standing, my hand resting on the back of my chair, my champagne flute frozen halfway to my lips. My son David was grinning that grin he gets when he's pulled off something clever, when he thinks he's said something witty in front of an audience. Everyone had laughed, of course, when he made the announcement. It was meant to be funny. That was the whole setup. You make a joke at your dad's retirement party, the crowd eats it up, everybody's on the same page. Except David wasn't joking. I could see it in the way his eyes were scanning the room, checking to see if I'd gotten the message. This wasn't a punchline, this was a plan, and he just announced it to everyone in my life like it was already decided, like my opinion on the matter was just a formality, something we'd skip over like the dessert course. My wife Margaret squeezed my arm, her fingers digging in a little harder than necessary. She was telling me something without words, the way women do after 43 years of marriage. Stay calm. Don't make a scene. This is your party. But it stopped being my party about 30 seconds ago when David opened his mouth. I've spent 67 years on this earth. 43 of those married to Margaret. Worked construction for 42 years before that. Started when I was 18 years old with nothing but a hammer and a work ethic my father beat into me. Built houses mostly. Did some commercial work, some renovations. Got good at it. Real good. Built our house in 1983 with my own hands. Every nail, every board, every bit of drywall. Put in the kitchen 3 times over the years. Kept upgrading it. Kept improving it. Built a workshop out back where I spent the last 15 years of my career taking on smaller jobs, mentoring younger guys, staying active. I paid off that house in 2001, 20 years ago, paid it off completely, no mortgage, just me, Margaret, and a probes. Odds are that's worth more now than I make in 5 years. My pension is solid, but not lavish. It comes in every month like clockwork. Enough to live on, enough to pay the property taxes, keep the house maintained, take Margaret on a trip once a year. Enough to be secure. I'd never had to want for anything. Never had to ask my kids for money. Never had to lean on anybody. David was the eldest. Still is. 38 years old. Works in finance, makes good money, moved to the city when he was 25. He'd married a woman named Susan who was perfectly nice in that distant corporate way. They had 2 kids, both teenagers now. Emily came 5 years after David. She was the peacekeeper, the one who always tried to smooth things over between her mother and David when he'd come home with news about some girlfriend Margaret didn't approve of, or some job change that seemed reckless. My youngest was Thomas. Tom had settled not far from us, still in the same town I'd spent my whole life in. Tom worked at the paper mill for 20 years before it shut down, then retrained as an electrician. Good steady work. He had 3 kids of his own. Tom visited every other Sunday for dinner. David came home maybe 4 times a year. Emily called every week without fail. I'd wanted for retirement to be peaceful. Margaret wanted the same thing. She'd worked as a nurse for 38 years, retired 2 years before me. We'd talked about travelling, about really taking time together for the first time in decades. But her knees had been getting worse, and the travelling part had become more about looking at travel brochures than actually booking anything. She spent most days in the garden, or inside reading. I spent my time in the workshop, building things that nobody really needed but that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied. We were content. Not thrilled, not struggling, just content. The retirement party had been Margaret's idea. I'd told her I didn't want a fuss, just a small dinner with family. But Margaret had always been the one to mark occasions. She believed in rituals, in acknowledging transitions, even if the person going through the transition wasn't particularly sentimental about it. She'd organised it, the restaurant on Oak Street, the Italian place where we'd gone for our 20th anniversary. She'd invited my old crew, some guys I'd worked with over the decades. She'd invited all 3 kids and their families. She'd invited some neighbours, a few people from her book club. It was supposed to be a celebration. Everyone would raise their glasses, tell stories about my career, make jokes about finally having time to sleep in. David would probably give a little speech about his old man. It would be warm and it would be done and we'd go home and it would be over. That's not what happened. I need to go back further to explain how we got to this moment. Back to early November, when I first noticed something was different. Margaret had always kept our finances organised. She tracked everything. The mortgages before we paid them off, the car payments, the insurance, the property taxes. But about 6 months before that retirement party, she'd asked me to take over the filing. Said her arthritis was making it hard to write things down and organise papers. I'd noticed that she'd accessed my life insurance information, that she'd been looking through documents related to the house. When I asked her about it, she'd just said she was organising things, making sure everything was in order in case anything ever happened to her I didn't push. I figured she was just being Margaret, being practical, making sure we didn't leave a mess if something went wrong. A few weeks before the party, David had called. He'd called a lot that fall, actually. Usually we'd talk maybe once every few weeks, just to catch up. But in September and October he'd been calling at least twice a week. Sometimes he'd ask about Mum. How's she doing? How are her knees? Is her health okay? Sometimes he'd ask me vague questions about the property, like how much do you think the place is worth these days? Have you looked at real estate values in the area? Sometimes he'd talk about his job, about being stressed, about things not going exactly how he'd planned. In early November, David had asked me directly if I'd be willing to come stay with them for a week. He said he and Susan had been talking about it, that it would be good for me to get away, to spend more time with the grandkids. I'd told him I'd think about it. I didn't really want to. David's house was nice but formal. Susan was the type who needed everything just so, who got tense if you used the wrong coffee cup. It wasn't a place where you could relax, and Margaret hadn't wanted to go either. She'd said her knees were too bad for travel, that she needed to stay home where she could move around at her own pace. Then, about a week before the retirement party, Emily had called. She'd sounded different on the phone, strained. She'd asked me how I was feeling about retiring, how I was feeling about life in general, if I was happy. I told her I was fine, that everything was fine. She'd pressed a little, asked me if I'd noticed anything odd with David recently. I'd said no, and she'd dropped it. But I remembered it. That conversation had stuck with me. Emily didn't usually call with vague questions and concerns. Emily asked direct questions and expected direct answers. The fact that she was being careful with me, treating me like I was fragile or needed to be handled gently, meant something was going on. The morning of the retirement party, Margaret had seemed nervous. She'd fussed with what she was wearing 3 times. She'd redone her hair twice. I'd asked her what was wrong, and she just said she wanted everything to be nice, that this was a big day. She'd also asked me to be prepared for the possibility that David might say something, that there might be an announcement of some kind. When I'd pushed for details, she'd declined to explain. She'd just held my hand and told me that I needed to trust her, that she loved me, that everything was going to be okay. At the restaurant, the first hour was nice enough. The old crew had showed up and we'd swapped stories about job sites from decades ago, about mistakes we'd made and problems we'd solved. Margaret had been at my side the whole time, her arm linked through mine. David had arrived late with Susan and the kids. He'd hugged me with that stiff formality that had crept into our relationship somewhere after he'd turned 25. When the food came out, people ate and drank and the noise level rose. Margaret had squeezed my arm again, that signal that something was coming. Then David had stood up. He'd tapped his fork against his glass the way people do to get attention. The room had quieted. Everyone had turned to look at him. Susan had been smiling beside him, that practiced corporate smile. The kids had been on their phones until David's wife had told them to put the devices away. My grandson had rolled his eyes but complied. David had taken a breath. He'd looked directly at me and said, "Dad, we're selling your house. You can move into assisted living." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, like he was delivering a quarterly earnings report. "We found a great facility not far from the city. It's very well regarded. You'll have a nice apartment, activities, people your own age. It'll be so much better for you than rattling around in that old house alone." The table had erupted in nervous laughter. People didn't know how to react. My neighbour Tom, who'd lived 3 houses down from us for 20 years, had let out an uncertain chuckle, like he was waiting for the punchline. My brother-in-law had done that thing where he laughs because he's uncomfortable. Even Emily had laughed, but I could hear the tension in it. But I could see David's face, and his face wasn't joking. His face was calm and resolved and ready for whatever came next. Margaret's grip on my arm had tightened until I could feel her fingernails through my sleeve, and that's when I stood up. That's when I put my hand on the back of my chair. That's when everyone realised that David hadn't been making a joke, that he'd been dead serious, that he'd just announced to 70 people that he'd made a unilateral decision about my life, about my property, about my future. I'd looked at Margaret, I'd looked at Emily, I'd looked at David. Then I'd picked up my champagne flute, I'd cleared my throat. Everyone had gotten quiet. They could sense something was coming. I'd said, "Well, I appreciate you letting everyone know about this decision you've made, but before we all toast to that future, I think everyone here should know the truth about what's actually happening. The truth about the house, the truth about why my own son thinks he can make decisions about my life without consulting me, and the truth about what I'm going to do about it." I tapped my glass one more time. Good news, the house is... And that's where we are. That's where the story really begins. Not with David standing at a dinner table making announcements, but with everything that led up to that moment. Because David didn't just wake up one day and decide to take control of my life. This had been building. This had been planned. And in order for you to understand what happened next, you need to know exactly how much I'd been left in the dark, and exactly how little my own family respected the man who'd built everything they thought they were entitled to. Let me back up to the beginning of everything. Let me tell you about the weeks before that party, about the phone calls and the strange questions and the way my family started treating me like I was already gone. It started in September, on a Tuesday. I remember because Tom usually comes for dinner on Sundays, but that Tuesday he'd called and asked if he could stop by in the evening after work. He'd sounded strange on the phone, nervous. I'd asked him if everything was okay, and he'd said yes, of course, he just wanted to talk. Tom's not the type to be mysterious or dramatic. If he wanted to talk, he usually just started talking. So the formality of setting up a specific time had put me on edge. He'd arrived around 6:30, just as Margaret was finishing up the dinner prep she'd made his favourite, her pot roast with the root vegetables. Tom had hugged her the way he always did, kissing her on the cheek like she was everyone's favourite grandmother. But he'd been quiet, helping with the plates and the silverware without being asked, the way people help when they're stalling. We'd all sat down and eaten for about 10 minutes before Tom had pushed his food around on his plate and said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something. David's been calling me, a lot, and he's been asking me questions about you and Mom, about your health, about the house." I'd asked him what kind of questions. Tom had said that David wanted to know if I seemed healthy, if I was struggling with anything, if I seemed depressed or confused or forgetful. He'd asked if Mum had mentioned any health problems. He'd asked if we were having money trouble. He'd asked if I'd mentioned anything about wanting to move or downsize. Tom had told David that everything seemed fine, that we were happy, that there was no reason for David to be so concerned. But David had kept pressing. He'd mentioned something about a family meeting, said he wanted to talk to everyone about the future, about making sure our parents were taken care of as we all got older. Margaret had set down her fork very carefully. She'd looked at me across the table. Then she'd looked at Tom and said, "David's been calling me too, asking similar things. I told him the same thing, everything is fine, but he doesn't seem to believe me." That was when I'd realised that something was being organised, something was being planned, and we were all dancing around the edges of it, not quite wanting to name it. Over the next few weeks, the calls increased. David had called me directly at least 5 times in October. He'd talked about getting older, about how houses are too much work for seniors, about how communities designed for older people are actually wonderful and full of activity. He'd mentioned specific facilities, told me he'd looked them up, said they had good reviews. He'd talked about estate planning, about making sure everything was organised for when Margaret and I weren't around anymore. He'd talked about property taxes and maintenance costs, like those were hardships, like they were problems that needed to be solved. I told him every single time that Margaret and I were fine, that we liked our house, that we had no plans to move. He'd listen politely, and then a week later he'd call again with a new angle, a new facility he'd read about, a new reason why staying in the house was actually a bad idea. Emily had called twice. Both times she'd sounded like she was delivering information that hurt her to deliver. She'd warned me that David was really concerned about us, that he'd been talking to Susan about the future, that he might want to have a family meeting to discuss options. I'd asked her what options existed, and she'd been evasive. She'd said she loved me, that she wanted me to know that she loved me and Mum both, that whatever happened, she wanted me to understand that she was on my side. Those statements didn't make sense unless there were sides to be on, unless there was a conflict brewing that I was supposed to be braced for. Margaret had grown quieter as October moved into November. She'd still been active, still moving around the house, still doing the things she loved. But she'd been checking the locks more than usual. She'd been making sure important documents were organised. She'd mentioned seeing an estate attorney, had asked me if I thought we should update our will. When I'd asked her why, she'd just said it was something we should probably do anyway, something responsible. I'd asked her directly if David had said something to her, something that was concerning him. She'd hesitated. Then she'd told me that David had called her about 2 weeks earlier, and he'd said that he and his wife and Emily and Tom were all worried about us, that we seemed to be in a state of decline, that they wanted to have a conversation about our future. She'd told David that there was no decline, that we were healthy and happy and had no desire to move. But David had pushed back. He'd said that she might be in denial, that sometimes older people didn't recognize when they were struggling. That's when I'd known for certain that this wasn't about our health. This was about our property. This was about our assets. And my own son was trying to convince my family that I was declining, that I needed to be managed, that my wishes regarding my own life were somehow invalid. I'd asked Margaret if David had mentioned anything about the house specifically. She'd said yes, he had. He'd said that the property was worth a significant amount of money, that it was an asset that could be better utilised, that in an assisted living facility we wouldn't need such an expensive property, and that the money from the sale could be invested, could be managed more carefully. Margaret had asked him if he meant managed by him, and David had gotten defensive, had said he was just thinking about our best interests, about making sure we were secure. What he really meant was that he wanted access to our money that we'd worked for, that we'd saved, that belonged to us, our property that we'd owned free and clear for 20 years. I'd asked Margaret if she had any idea why David was suddenly so interested in our financial situation. She'd admitted something then that had made my stomach turn cold. She'd said that about 3 months before the party, David had actually visited the house, when I was at a job site doing some maintenance work on a friend's basement. He'd come over with some excuse about needing to look at the plumbing because he wanted advice for his own house. But while he was here, he'd walk through every room asking Margaret questions about the house's condition, the roof, the windows, the foundation. He'd asked if there were any problems, anything that would need attention soon. He'd even taken pictures. When Margaret had asked him what he was doing, he'd been vague. He'd said he was just documenting things, just thinking about the future. Margaret had thought it was odd, but hadn't really connected the dots at the time. She'd been focused on her own health issues, her knees, her tired days. She hadn't been thinking strategically, but I was starting to think very strategically now. David had a mortgage on his city house, of course. Everyone has a mortgage when they're in finance and they want to seem successful. But I'd learned through Tom, through casual mentions at family gatherings, that David's mortgage was substantial. David also had expensive taste. Susan had redecorated their house twice in the 8 years they'd been married. Their kids went to private schools. They took vacations to Florida every winter. David drove a car that cost more than my first house, and all of that, I realised, required money, a lot of money. What I didn't know at the time, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that David was drowning. He had credit card debt that was spiralling. He had investment losses he hadn't told anyone about. He had made some bad business decisions that had cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars. Susan didn't know the extent of it. His colleagues at his finance firm certainly didn't. But he knew. He knew that he was running out of options, running out of places to borrow money, running out of time before something catastrophic happened. And looking at his aging parents, looking at their paid-off house on what had become a very valuable piece of real estate, David saw a solution. I didn't know all of this during that November period, but I could sense it. I could sense his desperation underneath the careful language about assisted living and community activities. I could sense that this wasn't coming from a place of concern for me or Margaret. It was coming from a place of need, hunger even. The week before the party, I'd done something I'm not particularly proud of. I'd gone through David's emails on the family computer. Margaret had his login information because she sometimes needed to check things when he was travelling. I'd used her information to access his email account. I'd wanted to see the emails from him to the facilities he'd mentioned, to understand exactly what he was planning. What I found instead was an email exchange between David and a real estate agent. The agent was a woman named Caroline, and she'd sent David preliminary assessments of our property, not just the house, but the full property value. The land was worth significant money. The house was worth significant money. The combined value was in the ballpark of $750,000, maybe more given the location and the market at the time. Carolyn had written to David suggesting that once the transition happens, they should move quickly to list the property. She'd mentioned that the spring market would be optimal for a quick sale at top dollar. She'd suggested that he coordinate with his siblings to potentially list it as a family estate sale, which could be expedited. So David had already been talking to a real estate agent. He'd already been planning the logistics. He hadn't been musing about the future, he'd been constructing a specific plan, and my retirement party was the perfect stage for the announcement. So that's what was being planned for my retirement party. That's what David was going to announce in front of 70 people, turning it into a public decision, making it seem settled and decided and fait accompli. He was going to take my retirement celebration and use it as a platform to announce that he'd made choices about my life, my property, my future. He was going to make it seem casual, make it seem like something we'd all agreed on, like it was just the natural next step. And he probably thought that once he'd said it publicly, once he'd embarrassed me in front of that many people, I'd just accept it. I'd give in. I'd let him sell the house and move me into some facility and manage my money the way he saw fit. But he didn't understand one thing. He didn't understand who I was, where I'd come from, what I was capable of. I'd built things with my own hands my entire life. I'd built this house from nothing. I'd raised 3 children. I'd made a life with a woman I loved for 43 years. I'd worked hard every single day for 42 years without complaining, without asking for anything I hadn't earned. And I sure as hell wasn't going to let my own son take that away from me, just because he had financial problems and wanted access to my property. So when David made that announcement, when he said we were selling the house and I was moving into assisted living, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I didn't go to that party unprepared. I didn't stand up at that table without a plan already in place. The week before the retirement dinner, after I'd read those emails between David and the real estate agent, after I'd understood exactly what was happening, I'd made a decision. I was going to gather evidence. I was going to document everything. I was going to understand the full scope of what David was planning, not just the house sale, but everything. The insurance changes, the property assessments, the financial pressure, all of it. And I was going to be ready because understanding your enemy is the first rule of strategy. Understanding what they want and why they want it gives you the advantage. On the Monday before the party, I'd called my lawyer. His name is Robert Chen, and I've known him for 25 years. We worked together on a contract dispute back in the 90s, and he'd stayed on as our family lawyer ever since I'd told him I needed to come see him urgently, that I had concerns about my children and my estate. He'd fit me in the same day, which told me he understood the gravity. When I got to his office, I'd brought copies of everything. The emails I'd accessed from David's account, printouts of the real estate assessment, notes of all the conversations Margaret had relayed to me, photographs of David's broken-in gate and the real estate agent's business card I'd found in the trash. I'd laid it all out on his desk and I'd told him exactly what my son was doing. Every detail, every phone call, every manipulative conversation, every financial pressure Margaret had experienced. Robert had listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. He's a careful listener, the kind of lawyer who doesn't jump to conclusions. His office was quiet except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The afternoon light was coming through the windows, and I could see dust motes floating in the air while my son's betrayal spread across Robert's mahogany desk. When I'd finished, he'd taken off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He'd been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd said, "This is serious. This is potential elder fraud. If David's trying to manipulate you into moving away from your property against your will, if he's making decisions about your life without your consent, if he's working with a real estate agent to liquidate your assets, there's a legal issue here, a significant one." I'd asked him what I should do. My voice had been calm, but inside I was burning. Robert had said the first thing was to make sure my documents were airtight. He'd pulled up my will and my power of attorney documents on his computer. He'd looked them over carefully, reading line by line, making notes. Then he'd asked me if I wanted to make any changes. I'd thought about it for a long time. I'd said, "I want to make sure that if anything happens to me, Margaret gets everything I want, that's absolutely clear. And I want to make sure that no one, including my children, can touch anything without explicit instruction from me or Margaret explicit written instruction. I don't care if they're desperate. I don't care if they claim it's an emergency. I want it locked down." Robert had nodded. He'd said that was wise. He told me he could draft new documents that very week. Stronger language, clearer restrictions, added protections. He'd also suggested that I get a separate life insurance policy review to make absolutely certain that my beneficiaries were exactly who I wanted them to be. These things get changed sometimes, he'd said, without the policyholder's knowledge. It's uncommon, but it happens. That's when I'd learned something that made my blood go cold. I'd pulled out our insurance information and I'd asked Robert to look at the policy details. He'd reviewed them, and then he'd told me something I didn't expect. He'd said that the beneficiary section had been modified. Not by me, not by Margaret. The signature on the modification didn't look right. It looked like someone had tried to forge Margaret's signature. My hands had shaken as I held that document. I could barely breathe. Robert had put his reading glasses back on and examined the document more carefully. He'd said, "This is fraud. Attempted fraud. Someone has forged Margaret's name on a beneficiary modification." He'd looked at me over his glasses. "Do you know who did this?" I'd said. "I have a very good idea." Robert had said we needed to report this to the insurance company immediately. He'd done it personally that afternoon, sending copies of the documents and a written statement that the modification was unauthorized. The insurance company had responded within 24 hours, saying they were investigating and that they were placing a freeze on any beneficiary changes until the matter was resolved. They'd also informed us that they would be contacting law enforcement. I hadn't told Robert explicitly that it was David who'd done it. I didn't need to, but the evidence was getting clearer every day. My son wasn't just thinking about selling the house. He was trying to manipulate our insurance. He was trying to gain control over our assets, while they still thought I didn't know what was happening. He was trying to do it in ways that would be difficult to unravel, difficult to prove he'd orchestrated. But he'd made a mistake. He'd tried to forge Margaret's signature and he'd done it poorly. That was his mistake. He'd thought he could do it quickly, do it while nobody was paying attention. He hadn't considered that eventually someone would check. Eventually the fraud would be discovered. Eventually there would be consequences. Over the next few days, I'd done something else. I'd hired a private investigator named Marcus Walsh. Marcus used to work with the police department before he went private. Tom had a friend who recommended him, told me Marcus was thorough, that he was careful, that he understood family dynamics, and didn't judge I'd met with Marcus at a coffee shop near his office. He was a lean man in his 50s, with careful eyes that had probably seen a lot. I told him I needed to understand my son's financial situation. Not in a casual way. I needed specifics. Debts, assets, liabilities, everything. I told him my son was potentially planning to commit fraud against me, and I needed ammunition. I needed facts. I needed a complete picture. Marcus had nodded like he'd heard this before. He'd said he'd look into it and get back to me within a week. That was tight timing with the party coming up, but I'd stressed that I needed answers before a certain date. I'd said the date mattered. It was when things were going to come to a head. Marcus had understood. He'd said he'd prioritize it. When Marcus called me back 4 days before the party, he'd had a comprehensive report. We'd met again at the same coffee shop. He'd brought a folder, thick with documents. David was in serious financial trouble. Deep trouble. The kind of trouble that doesn't resolve itself. He had credit card debt totaling over $80,000 across 9 different cards. His mortgage was significantly more than his income could comfortably handle, and he'd been making only minimum payments for the past 3 months. There were signs of compulsive gambling, casino visits multiple times a month, sometimes twice a week, significant cash withdrawals that corresponded exactly to casino trip dates. He had a pattern of making large purchases and then returning them within the return window, suggesting he owned. He was using that as a way to move money around. His investment account had been liquidated 6 months earlier, probably to cover debts, and most importantly, there were communications between David and several financial advisors discussing asset restructuring, which in context appeared to mean accessing his parents' property. There were phone records showing calls to estate attorneys. There were searches on his computer for information about elder guardianship and conservatorship laws. Marcus had spread the documents out on the table between us. He'd said, "Your son is drowning, and he's looking to you to save him. This is textbook elder manipulation, though technically you're not incapacitated, so it's not quite textbook elder fraud yet. But he's building toward it. See these conservatorship searches? He's trying to figure out how to have you declared incompetent so he can take control of your assets that way. The public announcement at the party makes sense in that context. He's trying to normalize the idea, to make it seem like it's something the family agrees on. He's trying to set up a narrative where you're confused, where you don't understand what's happening, where your children have to step in and make decisions for you. If I had to guess, I'd say that when you resist, he's going to start suggesting that you're cognitively declining, that you're not thinking clearly, that you need help managing your affairs. I'd paid Marcus in cash. I'd thanked him. I'd asked him if he could keep this confidential. He'd said that was his standard practice, and I'd felt something harden inside me as I left that coffee shop with the folder in my hands. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is hot and it makes you stupid. Anger makes you reactive, makes you sloppy. What I felt was cold. It was a cold understanding that my son had betrayed me, not in some abstract ideological way, not as a philosophical concept. He had actively conspired to take my property, my life's work, everything I'd built over 42 years of hard labour, and use it to solve his own problems. He'd involved other people. He'd forged documents. He'd tried to manipulate my wife. He'd tried to use my retirement party, the celebration of my career, as a public mechanism to embarrass me into compliance. He'd tried to make a spectacle of my life so that I'd be too humiliated to resist. My son had done this. My own son, the child Margaret and I had raised. The man we'd paid for college, the man we'd given every advantage to. He'd looked at us and decided we were just obstacles to be moved out of the way. By the morning of the party, I was ready. I had a plan. It wasn't a plan for revenge exactly, it was a plan for justice. But more than that, it was a plan to protect what I'd built. My house, my property, my life with Margaret, my autonomy, which David seemed to think was negotiable. I'd told Margaret what I was going to do. I'd walked her through it step by step. She'd listened quietly, and then she'd squeezed my hand. She'd said, "I'm with you. Whatever you need to do, I'm with you." That had meant everything to me, because Margaret had been the one hurt by David's attempts to forge her signature. By his sneaking around the house asking questions, by his manipulative phone calls, Margaret had felt his betrayal too. This wasn't just my fight, so when David stood up at that table and announced our future like he had the authority to do so, when he told everyone that we were selling the house and I was moving into assisted living, I'd already made my choice. I'd already decided how I was going to respond. I'd rehearsed it. I'd thought about the words. I'd imagined his face, his reaction, and I'd prepared myself to not feel anything about it. Because my son wasn't the person I'd thought he was, and sometimes you have to accept that and act accordingly. I stood up. I felt Margaret's hand on my arm, not restraining me but supporting me. Her grip was firm and steady. I picked up my glass. I looked at my son, and then I looked at everyone else at that table, all those people who'd known me for decades, who'd worked with me, who'd watched me work, who'd known my reputation. The table was quiet. Everyone could sense something was about to happen. I said, "Everyone here knows me. You've known me for years, most of you. You know I'm not a man who makes decisions lightly. You know I've built something with these hands." I held up my hands. They were weathered, scarred from work, still strong despite my age. The room was completely silent. You know that I've been careful with my life, careful with my family, careful with my choices, and I'm not a man who takes betrayal well. I'd looked directly at David when I said that last part. He'd gone pale. "So I want to tell you all something. The house is staying exactly where it is. I'm staying exactly where I am. And David, you're going to be served with legal documents regarding your attempted fraud, your forged signatures on my insurance, and your conspiracy to commit elder manipulation. Robert Chen is my lawyer, and he's already filed a report with the police department." The table had gone silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that happens when a bomb goes off. Susan's face had gone white, and she'd stared at David like he was someone she'd never seen before. My grandchildren had looked confused, trying to understand what was happening. Tom had looked like he might cry. Emily had closed her eyes, and I could see relief wash over her face. She'd known something was wrong. She'd tried to warn me subtly. And now she knew I'd been listening. She'd known I understood. David had stood up. His chair had scraped against the floor. The sound loud in that silent room. He'd said, "You're bluffing. You don't have proof." His voice had cracked on the word proof. I'd smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who'd already won and was just waiting for his opponent to realize it. I'd said, "Your emails to Caroline about selling the property. She's the real estate agent. You discussed our house in detail, our property value, the timing. Your emails are time-stamped and dated. Your casino receipts that Margaret found when she was doing laundry, now in my lawyer's files. The forged insurance documents with your clumsy attempt at Margaret's signature. The credit card statements showing $80,000 in debt across 9 different cards. The private investigator's report documenting your financial situation, your gambling habits, and your attempts to access our property through elder guardianship research. Your searches for conservatorship laws, David. All of it. You want money. Here to keep going, or is that enough proof? David's face had changed colour. He'd looked at Susan. She'd looked away from him. His kids had looked down at their plates, and then he'd walked out. He just stood up and left. We heard his car start in the parking lot outside. We heard him drive away. The silence had stretched out for a long moment. Then my brother-in-law had raised his glass and said, "Well, that was dramatic." But it wasn't over. Standing up at a dinner table was the easy part. What came next was harder. Because I'd just publicly accused my son of fraud and elder manipulation, I'd just told him I was going to press charges. I'd just made it clear that there were no easy answers here. No quick resolution where everyone went back to their lives and pretended nothing had happened. The old story where families sweep dysfunction under the rug and everybody suffers quietly. That wasn't going to happen. I'd started a war, and wars have casualties. The next morning at 6:55 a.m, David's lawyer called mine. His name was Stephen Kaufman, and he worked for a firm that specialised in defending white-collar crime. He wanted to know what proof I actually had, whether I was serious about pressing charges, whether we could settle this quietly without involving law enforcement. I sat in my kitchen with Margaret, listening to Robert on speakerphone as he explained to Kaufman that I was completely serious, that the evidence was substantial, that I was prepared to go to court if necessary, that I was prepared to press criminal charges and pursue civil action simultaneously. Robert had been calm and professional, the way lawyers are when they know they're holding winning cards. Kaufman had asked for a meeting. Robert had set one up for the following week, but I knew what would happen at that meeting. Kaufman would try to minimize the charges, would try to get me to agree to drop everything in exchange for David getting psychological help or anger management or some other fig leaf that would make everyone feel better about the situation. He would try to make this about David's mental health instead of his criminal behaviour. He would try to paint my son as a victim of stress and financial pressure. I wasn't interested in making anyone feel better. I was interested in making sure this never happened again. I was interested in making sure my son understood that actions have consequences, that betrayal has a price, that you cannot manipulate your own family into giving you access to their life's work without facing repercussions. I wasn't interested in being the bigger person, or taking the high road. I was interested in justice. Cold, calculated justice. So in the days between the party and the lawyers' meeting, I'd done something else. I'd contacted a financial advisor, and I'd had a comprehensive document prepared. I'd hired an accountant to calculate everything. This document laid out in detail exactly what would happen if David continued down this path. If he pled guilty to the fraud charges, he'd face criminal liability, probably 2 to 5 years, depending on the jurisdiction and the severity. If he fought them and lost, he'd face harsher penalties, maybe double. But more importantly, if he fought them, I was prepared to pursue civil action as well. I was going to sue him for the costs associated with the fraud, for the legal fees I was incurring, for the emotional distress Margaret had suffered. I was going to ask the court to make him pay for everything. The investigation costs, the lawyer fees, all of it. I was going to make sure that if he won, it cost him everything he had left, and if he lost, it would cost him even more. I'd shown this document to David, not through his lawyer, directly. I'd driven to his office in the city on a Wednesday morning, driven up the parking garage to his floor, walked into his building like I owned the place. I'd told the receptionist I was there to see David, and she'd let me write up. She recognised me from family events. He'd looked shocked when I walked into his office, shocked and afraid. His office was all glass and steel, very modern, very expensive, very fragile. I'd put the document on his desk. I'd said, "You have one choice, David. One. You can admit what you did. You can accept counselling and anger management. You can write a letter to your mother apologising for attempting to forge her signature. And I mean really apologising, not some corporate non-apology. And you can agree to stay away from our property and our finances. If you do that, I won't press charges. We'll handle this as a family matter. We'll tell people you're dealing with some financial stress, that you're getting help. We'll keep some dignity in it, or you can fight, and I will destroy you financially and legally. I will make sure you spend years in court, years dealing with criminal charges, and years paying me back for the privilege of betraying your family. Those are your options." He'd looked at me and I could see him calculating. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out if I was bluffing, trying to figure out if I would actually follow through, and I could see the moment he realised I wasn't. He'd said, If I admit to this, everyone will know. My firm will find out. Susan will leave me. I'll lose everything. I'd said, yes, that's the consequence of your actions. You don't get to escape consequences just because they're severe. The question is whether you lose everything, or whether you lose everything and go to prison on top of it. Those are your options. He'd cried. My son had actually cried, sitting in his expensive office chair in his expensive office, looking at the proof that his plan had failed. His plan had been so careful, so meticulous, and it had fallen apart in days. I'd stood there and watched him cry, and I'd felt nothing. No sympathy, no paternal instinct to comfort him, no urge to soften my position, nothing. Because at that moment I wasn't his father, I was a man protecting what was his, I was a man protecting my wife, my property, my life, and my son had chosen to be an enemy. That was his choice. I was just responding to it appropriately. He'd taken the first option. He'd admitted to everything. He'd agreed to counselling and anger management therapy. He'd written the apology letter to Margaret. Though she'd refused to read it for weeks, I'd told her she didn't have to. When she finally opened it months later, she'd just shaken her head and thrown it away. He'd signed documents acknowledging his debts, agreeing to repay the money he'd tried to access through various schemes. He'd agreed to stay away from the house, away from our property, away from our finances. He'd also resigned from his job before his firm could discover the situation. He'd done it himself, sent in his resignation the day after our meeting at his office. In the end, he'd managed to avoid criminal charges by making a full confession and agreeing to financy, our restitution, but his career was over. His entire life had changed in 48 hours. His marriage, which had been shaky at best, had fallen apart within a month. Susan had hired her own lawyer. She'd taken the kids. He'd lost the house, lost access to his children, lost his job, lost his professional reputation. He'd lost everything, just not in the way he'd initially planned, and he'd have to live with that for the rest of his life. Margaret and I had donated his restitution payments to a charity that helped elder fraud victims. We'd thought it was appropriate. We'd thought it might make something good come from the whole terrible situation, that maybe other elderly people would be protected because of what David had tried to do. It seemed like the only redemption available. Emily had called after she'd heard about David's confession. She'd cried. She'd apologised for her brother, which I told her wasn't necessary. She'd said she'd known something was wrong, but she hadn't wanted to betray David, hadn't wanted to cause family conflict. I'd understood completely. I'd told her that she'd warned me in her own way, and that I'd listened. That was what mattered. Family is complicated. Love doesn't disappear just because Umyon acts badly. Emily had loved her brother, and she'd also known he was wrong. That's the reality of family. She'd thanked me for protecting Margaret, for not letting David's scheme succeed. And then we'd just talked for a while, not about anything important, just two people who'd been through something difficult together. Tom had come to dinner the Sunday after the party. He'd brought his wife and his kids. He'd hugged Margaret first, then he'd hugged me. He'd held on a little longer than necessary. He'd said, "Thank you for handling that the right way." I'd asked him what he meant. He'd said, "You could have just given him the money. You could have let him manipulate you into thinking you were crazy, into doubting yourself. A lot of fathers would have. They'd have given in just to make the conflict stop. But you stood up to him. You made him face what he'd done. That took courage." I'd accepted the thanks, but I'd also told Tom that this was about more than just protecting ourselves. It was about teaching a hard lesson. Sometimes kids need to learn that they can't manipulate their families. Sometimes they need to learn that consequences are real. Sometimes they need to learn that their parents are stronger than they think, that we're not easy targets just because we're older. The thing about having a confrontation like that, the kind where you win but everyone loses, is that it doesn't feel like winning. It feels hollow. It feels like you've just closed a door on a part of your life that you never expected to close. I kept thinking about that in the days after everything settled down, after David had officially resigned from his job, after Susan had hired her divorce lawyer, after the restitution paperwork had been filed with the courts. I'd won. I'd stood at that dinner table and I'd exposed my son's betrayal in front of everyone we knew, and I'd made it clear that there were consequences for what he'd tried to do. But sitting in my living room with Margaret, looking out at the house I'd fought so hard to keep, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. I felt in a way I couldn't quite articulate to anyone except Margaret, and even she couldn't fully understand it. What I hadn't expected was how quickly everything would accelerate after that dinner. The legal system, once activated, moves with its own momentum. David's lawyer had wanted to settle quietly, but the insurance company had already filed their own report with the police. They'd been moving on the fraud angle independently of what I'd done, so when David confessed, when he admitted to forging Margaret's signature on the insurance documents, the police had no choice but to pursue it officially. They'd come to the house 2 days after the dinner with a warrant to search his office. I'd watched them bag documents, seen them photograph things on his desk. They'd been professional and thorough, treating it like the crime it was, because that's what it had been. Not a family disagreement, not a desperate man acting out of financial stress. A crime. My son had committed a crime against me and my wife, and the legal system was forcing us all to face that reality. The weeks that followed were strange in ways I hadn't anticipated. David had agreed to counselling as part of the settlement, but he was also facing criminal charges for the fraud and the attempted manipulation. His lawyer was suggesting a guilty plea to minimise his sentence, but David seemed to be wavering, thinking maybe he could fight it, maybe he could claim mental duress or some other defence. I didn't care what he did at that point. I'd moved past anger into something that felt more like resignation. My son had shown me who he was, and I'd accepted that he was a man capable of betraying his family for money. He was a man willing to forge documents and manipulate his mother and conspire against his father. That's who he was. Accepting that had been liberating in a strange way because it meant I could stop hoping he'd be different. Stop hoping he'd come to his senses and realise what he'd done. He was who he was, and I could take precautions accordingly. Emily had called me 3 weeks after the dinner. She wanted to know if we could have lunch, just the two of us, without Margaret. There was something in her voice that suggested this was important. I'd agreed. We'd met at a little Italian restaurant she liked, one we'd been going to since she was in college. She'd ordered a salad and barely eaten any of it, just pushed it around her plate while she talked. She'd said that she'd known something was wrong with David for years, but she'd never wanted to say anything to us because she hadn't wanted to be the one who caused family conflict. She'd felt guilty knowing about his gambling, knowing about his financial troubles, knowing about his pressure on Susan and the kids. She'd felt like it was her responsibility to manage family peace, to keep everyone happy, and when she couldn't do that, she felt like she'd failed. I'd listened to this and I'd understood it immediately, because I recognised it as the burden I'd put on her without meaning to, by protecting her from family drama, by trying to shelter her from the truth about her brother. I'd made her think it was her job to fix things, to manage other people's behaviour, to take responsibility for situations that weren't hers to control. I told her something that day that I'd been thinking about a lot. I'd said, "Emily, you're not responsible for your brother's choices. You're not responsible for managing our family's dysfunction. The only thing you're responsible for is your own life, your own choices, your own moral compass. And from what I can see, that's just fine. You warned me in the way you could. You didn't betray your brother, but you also didn't protect him from the consequences of his actions by staying silent. You did exactly what you should have done." She'd cried a little when I said that. She'd thanked me, and we'd just sat there for a while, not talking, just being together the way fathers and daughters do when they're navigating something difficult. The trial date had been set for the following spring, but David's lawyer had convinced him to take the plea deal. He'd plead guilty to the insurance fraud, he'd agree to psychological evaluation and treatment, and in exchange the prosecutor would recommend a reduced sentence, 2 years instead of 5, 2 years in federal prison for trying to commit elder fraud against his own parents. When I'd heard about the plea deal, I'd thought about how much worse it could have been, how much worse it should have been. But I'd also thought about the people who didn't get that mercy, the elderly couples who weren't cautious enough, who didn't have lawyers like Robert Chen, who didn't have investigators like Marcus Walsh. For them, this would have worked. David's plan would have succeeded Margaret, and I would have been manipulated out of our home, out of our savings, and probably out of our independence. We'd have been victimised by our own son, and we'd have suffered for it in ways that aging people suffer when they lose their autonomy. That was the injustice that had driven me to pursue this so relentlessly, more than my own betrayal. The thought of other people in other homes experiencing what David had tried to do to us. So I'd stood with Margaret and Robert in the courthouse hallway before the sentencing, and I'd listened to the judge explain David's sentence 2 years in a minimum security federal facility, to be followed by 5 years probation, restitution payments to be made monthly, mandatory psychological treatment, both during incarceration and after the judge had looked at me specifically when announcing the restitution. She'd said that the victim impact statement I'd provided had influenced her, thinking I'd written about Margaret's fear when she'd realised her signature had been forged. I'd written about the sense of violation I'd felt. Discovering my insurance had been altered without consent, I'd written about the breach of trust that comes from having your own child betray you. I'd described the sleepless nights, the paranoia, the constant vigilance. I'd explained how it felt to realise that someone you'd raised, someone you'd supported and believed in, had looked at you and decided you were just an obstacle to overcome. The judge had taken all of that seriously. She'd made it clear that David's status as my son didn't give him special treatment, didn't excuse his actions, didn't mean he could walk away with a light sentence. The law protected people from fraud, even when the perpetrator was family. When David stood for sentencing, he'd looked smaller than I remembered. Prison was going to be hard on him. He wasn't a violent man, and from what the guards had told us, men like that struggled in incarceration. The other prisoners would sense his weakness, would test him. He'd have to find a way to survive, to build relationships, to navigate a system he'd never been equipped to handle. Part of me felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but I'd extinguished it quickly. He'd made this choice. Every step of the way, he'd had opportunities to make a different choice, and he'd chosen the path to prison instead. I wouldn't waste my compassion on someone who deliberately betrayed his own parents for money. After the sentencing, David had served his 2 years. Margaret and I had gotten the notification when he was released. 3 months early for good behaviour. I thought about what that meant for a moment. Whether early release indicated reform or just good prison behaviour. Probably just the latter. You can learn to follow prison rules without learning anything about redemption. He'd gone to live with his cousin Michael in Toronto, somewhere far enough away that we wouldn't see him by accident on the street. Emily had told me he was trying to rebuild his life, that he was working at a car rental place and going to therapy. She'd said he'd asked about us, wondered if maybe someday we could repair things. I'd told Emily that some things, once broken, can't be repaired. They can only be accepted. Ed is broken and then lived with accordingly. I'd told her that I'd moved past the anger, which was true, but that didn't mean I'd moved back to trust once broken with deliberation, with premeditation, with carefully constructed lies and forged documents. That doesn't come back. It doesn't matter what therapy you do or how sorry you become. Some boundaries, once established, are permanent. I'd acknowledged that information about David without feeling much about it. He could rebuild his life. That was his right. But he'd never have access to ours again. That boundary had been established, and it would hold, regardless of what he did with his time on the outside. It wasn't cruelty, it was realism. It was understanding that some people will hurt you if they get the chance, and the kindest thing you can do for them and yourself is to not give them that chance. What I'd started to notice, though, as the months passed and the legal processes finally wound down, was that I was angry in a different way, not at David specifically, but at myself. I was angry that I'd raised a son who was capable of this. I was angry that somewhere in my parenting I'd failed to instill the values that would have prevented him from trying something like this. I was angry that I'd been so focused on being a good provider, on building a house and accumulating assets, that I'd maybe not focused enough on building character in my children. Margaret had told me I was being too hard on myself, that parents don't control how their children turn out, that David had made his own choices. She was right, of course, but that didn't stop me from examining my role in it all, from wondering what I could have done differently. It was Tom who'd finally talked me out of that spiral. He'd come over on a Saturday morning, and he'd found me working in the garage on a project that didn't really need doing, just something to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. He'd said, "You can't torture yourself about this forever. David made his choices. You responded appropriately. That's done." I'd told him I felt like I'd failed as a father. Tom had said, "You failed at what exactly? Being perfect? Predicting that your son would turn into a criminal? Raising a kid who never makes mistakes? None of us did any of that. Emily turned out great. I turned out okay, I think. And David turned out like David. That's life. You take your kids in the direction you're trying to go, and then they become who they become. Some of them learn the lesson. Some of them don't. But that's not a failure on your part. That's just being human." The retirement party itself had been overshadowed by all of this, of course. The event that was supposed to be celebratory had become a moment of family reckoning. Some of the people from my office had still wanted to acknowledge my 30 years of service, so we'd scheduled a second event, a smaller one, just for work colleagues. That had been nice. No family drama, no betrayal. Just people talking about cases we'd worked together, memories we shared, the impact I'd had on my career and on theirs. I'd given a little speech about what 30 years had taught me, and I talked about the importance of showing up every day, doing the work and treating people with respect, even when they didn't deserve it. I'd thought about David when I said that last part. I'd treated him with respect, had given him the benefit of the doubt, had tried to support him, and he'd used that against me. But I didn't regret treating him well. I regretted that he'd chosen to respond to that respect with betrayal. At night, Margaret and I would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, and we'd talk about everything that had happened. She'd tell me about moments I'd missed, things David had said to her when he thought I wasn't listening. She'd tell me about the moment she realised her signature had been forged, how violated she'd felt, how angry she'd been that her own child had done that. She'd tell me that she'd never forgiven him for it, and she didn't think she ever would. I'd understand completely. What David had done to her, the violation of her signature, the attempt to use her name without her knowledge or consent, that was a different kind of betrayal than what he'd done to me. It was more intimate, more personal. It was about her autonomy and her agency and her right to control her own identity. I'd hold her hand while she talked about this, and I'd let her know that I understood, that I didn't expect her to forgive him just because he was her son. Some betrayals were too deep for that kind of forgiveness. Looking back now, with some distance from it all, I can see that what happened to us wasn't unique. Elder fraud happens all the time. Families manipulate their elderly relatives for money all the time. Parents are betrayed by their children all the time. We were lucky, in a sense, because I'd caught it early. I'd been paranoid enough, experienced enough, careful enough to notice the patterns and understand what was happening. But not everyone has those advantages. Not everyone has a lawyer like Robert or an investigator like Marcus. Not everyone has the financial resources to fight back through the courts. For every family like ours that escaped being victimized, there are families that didn't. Elderly people living alone, isolated from family, vulnerable to manipulation. That's the real tragedy here. Not what David tried to do to us, but all the people who don't have anyone to protect them. That's why I decided to do something about it. I started working with a non-profit that helps elderly fraud victims. I gave talks at senior centres about how to recognise manipulation, how to protect yourself, what signs to watch for. I told our story, not to shame David, but to help people understand that this kind of manipulation often comes from people close to you, people you love and trust. It comes quietly. It doesn't announce itself. You have to be vigilant. You have to trust your instincts. And if something feels wrong, it probably is. I'd tell people about the emails I'd found, the research David had done into conservatorship laws, the financial pressure that had driven him to desperation. I'd explain the pattern of increasing requests, the way they start small and then escalate. I'd describe the isolation tactics, the way my son had tried to push me away from certain people, to make me doubt the advice of my lawyer and my wife. I'd talk about the forged documents, the lies, the careful construction of a narrative where he was the victim and I was the problem. And I'd tell them that it's okay to protect yourself even when it means protecting yourself from your own family. That's not betrayal. That's survival. That's the most basic form of self-preservation available to people who find themselves in dangerous situations with people who are supposed to love them. The responses I got from those talks were sometimes surprising and sometimes heartbreaking. I'd have elderly women come up to me afterward with tears in their eyes and tell me that my story had just described their situation exactly, that they had a daughter or a son who was pressuring them to move, to sell their house, to give them access to accounts, that they'd been questioning their own sanity, wondering if maybe they were being paranoid or overprotective, and hearing my story had made them realize they weren't crazy. They were being manipulated. One woman, Margaret ironically, had told me that my talk had probably saved her life. She'd said that if she'd given her son the money he was asking for, the money he'd claimed was for a business opportunity. She probably would have lost her house within a year. She'd never have recovered from that loss. I'd held her while she cried, and I'd felt like all of this. All the pain and the betrayal and the legal costs. It was worth it if it meant preventing that Margaret had supported this work completely. She'd even started sitting in on some of the talks, sharing her perspective on what it felt like to have your identity stolen, to have someone forge your signature. She'd described the violation in a way that only someone who'd experienced it could convey. She'd talk about looking at a document and seeing her name signed by someone else's hand, someone she'd trusted completely, and feeling like part of her had been taken without permission. She'd talk about the anger that came from that violation, the sense that a boundary had been crossed that could never be fully uncrossed. We'd become, in a strange way, advocates for elder protection. We'd taken the worst thing that had happened to us and we'd tried to make something useful out of it. We'd turned our pain into education, into awareness, into concrete steps that other people could take to protect themselves and their loved ones. I'd created a checklist of warning signs. Margaret had written out a guide on how to respond if you discover fraud in your name. We provided templates for letters to send to your bank, your insurance company, law enforcement. We documented everything we'd learned so that other people didn't have to go through what we had gone through. It didn't erase what David had done, it didn't make the betrayal less real. But it gave it meaning. It made our suffering serve a purpose beyond just the personal. Time did what it always does. It moved forward. Year passed, 2 years, 5 years. David remained in Toronto, living his life, working his job, going to his therapy sessions. We occasionally heard updates through Emily, who maintained a distant but cordial relationship with her brother. He'd gotten into a new relationship, started dating someone stable. He seemed to be building a life that was smaller than the one he'd tried to access through fraud, but perhaps more honest, I didn't follow his life closely. I didn't care what he did anymore. He'd been removed from my life in the way that matters, which is psychologically and emotionally. Physically, he lived in another province, but spiritually he'd been gone since that dinner party, when I'd realised he was capable of betraying me. What I'd learned through all of this, what I'd held on to despite the pain and the anger and the disappointment, was something my father had told me once when I was much younger. He'd said, "Life is what you do when your plans fall apart." I'd planned for my retirement to be about peace, about enjoying what I'd built, about spending time with my family. Instead, it had become about fighting my own son, about proving that I wasn't a victim just because I was older, about defending what was mine. My plans had fallen apart in the most painful way possible, and what I'd done with that fallen apart life was everything I could do with integrity and determination and love for Margaret. I'd protected what mattered. I'd exposed lies. I'd held people accountable. I'd tried to make something good come from something bad. That's not how I wanted my retirement story to begin, but it's what happened, and I lived it as well as I could. Margaret would sometimes say to me late at night when we were lying in bed, "We came through it okay." And I'd squeeze her hand and agree we did come through it okay. We came through it with our house, our savings, our autonomy intact. We came through it with our marriage stronger, our bond tested and proven solid. We came through it with Emily standing beside us, with Tom supporting us, with the rest of the family understanding what had happened and respecting the stand we'd taken. We came through it having learned something valuable about who we are and what we're capable of when we're forced to protect ourselves. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. The retirement that was supposed to be about rest and relaxation had become something else entirely. It had become an education in betrayal, in resilience, in the importance of not being a victim just because someone you love has decided to treat you like one. It had taught me that age doesn't equal weakness. That experience actually counts for something, that the instincts I'd developed over decades of life were worth listening to, even when they suggested something terrible about someone I'd raised and loved. It had taught me that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary, it's moral, it's the right thing to do. I still think about David sometimes, usually late at night. I think about the man I'd hoped he would become and the man he actually turned out to be. I think about the moments where different choices might have changed the trajectory of his life. But mostly I think about the choices he made, the deliberate steps he took, the careful planning he engaged in to commit fraud against his parents. And I think about how that doesn't reflect on me, or on Margaret, or on the way we raised him. It reflects on him. It reflects on his character, his values, his inability to handle adversity without turning to manipulation and deception. That's not something I could have prevented. That's something only he could have chosen differently, and he didn't. What I'm proud of is that when faced with that betrayal, we didn't collapse. We didn't go into denial about it. We didn't protect David at the expense of ourselves. We stood up, we got help, we documented everything, we went through the legal process, and we made sure that what he tried to do had consequences. We didn't do it out of anger, though anger was certainly part of what we felt. We did it because it was right. We did it to protect ourselves and others like us. We did it because the alternative was to become victims, and neither Margaret nor I were willing to accept that outcome. That dinner party, which started with my son announcing that we were selling our house like he had the right to make that decision, ended with me standing up and making it clear that I did have the right to decide my own future. It ended with David understanding that there were consequences for betrayal, that you can't manipulate your own parents and walk away unscathed. It ended with our family understanding that we don't accept lies, that we protect each other, that we hold people accountable for their actions. And looking back now, with years of distance and perspective, I can say that I'm grateful for that moment. Grateful for the pain of it, grateful for the difficulty, grateful for being forced to confront the reality of who my son was and what he was capable of, because that confrontation, as painful as it was, saved us. It prevented a much greater tragedy. It allowed us to move forward with our eyes open, with our boundaries clearly established, with our autonomy protected.